Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Thank you so much. It's a real delight to be back in Aggie Land. I was here about 10 years ago and remember it vividly, and so it's a real pleasure to be back again tonight. I'm just sorry I'm never here in your football season. They ought to arrange these forums at a better time of the year so I can really see if the Aggies are as good as many of you today have told me they are. I love the pride that you have in your team. No, it's a real pleasure. And it's always a pleasure to come to a Veritas forum. Because when they were founded at Harvard, and they've now spread to nearly 200 universities around the world, the challenge is always to pick up the great issues of our time and to explore them, and many of us are speakers doing so from the vantage point of our Christian faith, but to be open to people of all faiths and no faiths, and really to tackle these issues adventurously. And I want to speak tonight on an issue that will undoubtedly be a key to the human future. And I'm delighted to do it here. Once when I was at Stanford, I was asked the rather unusual question, if you could be born in any generation except your own, which one would you choose? And you hear questions and you think, what do they have in mind? And I thought, are they expecting me to say the Athens of Pericles, or the Rome of Hadrian, or the America of the founders, or the England of William Pitt and William Wilberforce? What were they expecting me to say? But as I thought fast, I thought, your generation. Because as you look at the future of the human race, it's now said that your generation, you who are rising in your 20s, your adulthood will be a crunch generation in the sense that many of the great issues in the global era are converging. Economic, demographic, environmental, nuclear, all sorts of things. They are converging so that if the human race answers them responsibly and well, there are prospects for calmer sailing. But if they answer them badly or just drift and don't answer them at all, we're in for a turbulent future to come. And your generation has to answer many of these questions. And the question I want to raise tonight is actually abstract sounding, but it underlies many of the other big questions that the human race will face. And the one I want to tackle is this: how do we live with our deepest differences? And I want to suggest to you that the answer is what one of the great early Americans called soul freedom. Freedom of thought and conscience for everyone. And to make that possible, not just soul freedom, but civility. And to make that practical, to achieve soul freedom and civility in the toughest place of all, the public squares of our advanced modern world. So that's what I want to talk about. It would be a safe bet that at any moment in the last 25 years, someone somewhere in the world was being killed in the name of religion. And you can all think of the arc of violence that spread around the world. Just think of Iraq, Sunni against Shia, the same religion. Cross over to Kashmir, it would have been Hindus and Muslims. Drop down to India, and it would be Hindu nationalists against all sorts of people, including Christians and Buddhists. Drop down to Sri Lanka, and it would be Hindus and Buddhists fighting it out. And you could go around the world like that and see how sectarian violence is a humanitarian nightmare. But that is just one of the three central sources of the problem that we're talking about: ethnic and sectarian violence. The greater problem is actually government repression, whether from extreme secular totalitarian societies like China or strong religious authoritarian societies like Iran. But there's a third source of the problem today, not just government repression and not just sectarian violence, but also the mounting violations and discriminations, not persecution, the mounting violations and discriminations of these issues in the Western world. And you can think in this country how for 50 years now, the United States has had a mounting culture wars. And at the heart of so much of it, since the early school prayer cases, has been religion and public life. So how do we live with our deep differences? Sounds abstract. And yet it's an issue that underlies so many of the other issues that humanity will have to answer. Now, it's very easy to see why this is so big a topic today. First, it's become a global issue. It's said that in our modern world, everyone is now everywhere. A little exaggerated, but you know what they mean. Through the mass movement of people, migrations, through the media, through travel, we've never had such a sense of all those others popping up in all sorts of places in all of our lives. And it's not just little private religious preferences, but entire worldviews and ways of life, elbow to elbow with other entire worldviews and ways of life, always in the same society. Now, there are periods rather like that in the past. Say the Roman Empire had extraordinary diversity, but the world as a whole has never seen it as we have in its explosive form today. The second factor that's exacerbating that is the fact that many of the earlier settlements of religion and public life are floundering. If you look, for instance, around our Western world, you can take examples like the French, the English, and the American, and you can see how these settlements were shaped by a particular year in these nations' history, and they were so formative they've cast the light down the centuries since then. But today, they're under tremendous stress because of the exploding pluralism. So take the French. Obviously, for the French, the key year was 1789 in the Revolution. And you understand the French mindset. If you hear the cry of the Jacobin radicals, we want to strangle the last king with the guts of the last priest. A little gory and gruesome for their victims, but you understand what they were saying. You had a corrupt church and a corrupt state, and they were in collusion and highly oppressive. So the revolution threw off both of them. And if you were in favor of faith in France, you were reactionary. And if you were in favor of freedom, you were secularist. And that mentalité, that mindset, comes right down to today with the so-called French laïcité, which is now butting heads with Muslims who want to, for example, wear their headscarves. The English situation came from 1688. The so-called Glorious Revolution and the Act of Toleration. They kept a state church, the Church of England, but since that time it has no blood on its hands. There's no massacre like the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in France. And so in England there's never been any militant anti-clericalism, but nobody likes an establishment that's coerced, and it's slowly faded away until it's today very weak. And the cynics say the Church of England's only there for the hatching, matching, and dispatching of citizens. In other words, you baptize them, marry them, bury them, and that's all it's for. Now, your American situation, of course, goes back to which year? Hope we have some historians and not just engineers and scientists. Which year? Haven't heard the crucial date yet. I may have misheard you. 1791. That was the year of the First Amendment to the Bill of Rights. And as you know, they disestablished religion. And faith flourished, not despite disestablishment, but because of it. Because for the first time in European and Western history, it was now voluntary. And people could choose what they believed based on the dictates of conscience. Now, here's the point though. Those three great settlements, maybe the biggest in the Western world, all were shaped by their historical past, but today, with the explosive situation, they're all under stress, and in many ways they need to be rethought through in the light of this modern condition. Now, I would argue that the English and the French can hardly be renegotiated. They're not in any way able to adapt to the modern situation. The tragedy of America is this was once known as the most nearly perfect settlement, but you can see in 50 years of culture warring, the last generation of Americans have abandoned your founders' settlement, and now we're drifting somewhere between the French situation and something else. So all the various settlements are under stress. But there's a third reason why this is important today too, and that is we're beginning to see the emergence of a very rudimentary, but nevertheless real, global public square. What do you think of when you think of a public square? Well, the idea goes back to the Greeks, the agora in Athens. Some of you may have seen it. They didn't just sell things there like a marketplace, but they came together in the public square to debate and deliberate and decide the issues of common public life. So that was why it was so important. But of course, it was a literal place. It was the agora in Athens. It was the forum in Rome. It was the Houses of Parliament in Westminster. It was the French Assembly in Paris. It was the US Congress on Capitol Hill. A physical place. But with the rise of the English-speaking democracies, the public square was not only a physical place, it was a metaphor for any place where citizens come together to discuss the issues of our common public life. So not only the US Capitol and so on, but also the op-ed pages of the newspaper or talk shows on radio or television. They were part of the public square, citizens debating together. But now, here's the point. We're in the age of the internet. And if you look at things like the Danish cartoon controversies, or the responses to the Pope's speech at Regensburg, or the fatwas issued against Salman Rushdie, and so on, what you can see very clearly is a very simple and obvious thing. In the internet era, even when we're not speaking to the world, we can be heard by the world and the world can respond. And we're seeing the beginning of a very rudimentary but nevertheless real virtual global public square. And it raises the question, how do we live with our deep differences to a new level? Are we to be content with little sound bites and limited character tweeting or anonymous names on the blogs that issue in such degrading speech? Or are we to work out how we live in the public square globally in ways that do justice to our humanity and the greatness of whatever democratic past we have? That's the issue I want to put forward tonight. Now let me do it in putting a number of simple propositions to you, and you wrestle with this, and by all means come back at me in the discussion, because we're all looking for a better way for our human future. I've wrestled with this for a number of years, and by all means disagree with me, and let's point things forward in an even better way. Number one, though, for you to think about. Clarify why freedom of thought and conscience is so vital. Let me give you 3 reasons. First, in your American history and in the American experiment, freedom of thought and conscience was always the first liberty. There is no hierarchy of rights. That would be invidious. But if you read the framers and the founders, they were very clear about how the 3 core rights, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, and freedom of assembly, were inseparable and interlocking. And you can think of it logically. You want freedom of assembly, the right to associate with people. Why? You don't want to just arrive and hug each other. You want to get together to say something. And in fact, freedom of assembly assumes and requires freedom of speech. But equally, if you think about it, freedom of speech assumes and requires freedom of conscience. You're free to talk about the weather or some new restaurant or whatever. But that's not what the right is about. It's about the freedom to speak of those things above all of which you're convinced because you are bound by the dictates of conscience. And as philosophers point out rightly, freedom of conscience is different from freedom of choice. Freedom of choice, you are sovereign. Choose what you like. Freedom of conscience, you are subject. You are bound by the dictates of conscience. In the words of Martin Luther at the Diet of Worms, here I stand, and then the famous line, I can do no other. And freedom of conscience is respected because people are not just choosing something sovereignly, but they're bound by their conscience, and therefore conscience is respected, and no government can come between an individual and her or his conscience. And it was considered the first liberty. Now, today in America, it's often discounted. People say religious liberty, liberty for the religious. Who cares about them? Or many people say religious liberty is like the appendix in the body. And we can have our appendix removed and we're fine. In other words, it's a constitutional redundancy. And what really matters is something like free speech. Now, if the framers are right, they're all wrong. Freedom of conscience is the first liberty. It was only as it was guaranteed that the others came along too, and it will only be so long as it is guaranteed that the others will be protected too. Now we've got to make that argument, and as you know well, even in the last month, that's issues come up in a big way in this country, and it's also come up in a big way in various European discussions too. Religious liberty, freedom of thought and conscience is the first liberty. The second reason, though, freedom of conscience and religious liberty are the key to civil society. You know how the late Christopher Hitchens so often said religion poisons everything. Well, it was one of his dramatic points, which he knew was absolute rubbish. Rubbish. Because the simple fact is, if you take, say, the West, one of its most distinctive features is its commitment to the reform movements. God knows there were things that needed reforming, but no other civilization has that recurring commitments to reform movements. The banning of infanticide in the Roman Empire, the banning of the gladiatorial games, Bartolomé Las Casas standing up against the conquistadores, William Wilberforce, that supreme abolition of slavery, and of course right down to Dr. Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. They were all, and there were hardly any exceptions, inspired by faith and led by people of faith. The idea that religion poisons everything is just plain stupid. Now here we are, though, in a discussion today of what's called civil society. And as you know well what that means, the idea that between individual citizens and the government, a society is healthy if it has a thick layering of organizations in which people can volunteer and give and participate and engage and bring their generosity and their sacrifice and their time and so on. And when people are doing this in all sorts of ways, you have a healthy civil society. And there's no question that what makes this thriving is actually the faith-based initiatives from whatever faith it is that are so vital to this. And when you disestablish faith so that each faith is on its own feet, doing things according to its own visions, its own generosity, its own sacrifice, you have this vital entrepreneurialism that America has represented, and the First Amendment is very closely linked to that. And freedom of thought and conscience is vital to a healthy civil society. There's a third reason, though, why religious liberty is so important. And that is, it's the key to social harmony. Dr. Cornwell mentioned I was born in China. The current president of China, Hu Jintao, often goes on and on about the harmonious society. When I'm in China, I wouldn't say it to him personally, but I'd say it at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. I tell my Chinese friends there, that is no big deal. China has remarkable diversity and relative harmony. Why? Coercion. The real challenge is to have diversity with liberty and still achieve harmony. And that's what this country has done better than any other in history. How? Well, the First Amendment, guaranteeing freedom of thought and conscience, has allowed two things to come together which rarely do: strong religious convictions and strong political civility. Other parts of the world have one or the other, but not often both. Take, say, Western Europe. Any of you been to Western Europe or know the history of post-war Europe? From the end of the war right down to the massive immigration from the British Commonwealth or the Muslim immigration from Africa, Western Europe, with one exception, Northern Ireland, was remarkably civil about religious differences. But any of you been there, you probably know why. There wasn't any religion to be uncivil about. Take a simple comparison. Let's take the Scandinavians. Where the Scandinavians from Europe settle over here? Well, the upper Midwest, Minnesota and so on. Church going for most of the period I was talking about in Minnesota was in the 70%. Well above the American average, which has hovered around 40% for a long time. But what was it in Sweden? 3%. Well, if only 3% go to church, they're not going to be fighting about faith and public life in any serious way. They have the strong civility and no religious convictions. Obviously, the Middle East is the opposite problem. Passionate religious convictions, no civility, no liberty, not even life. And they're still killing each other almost every day. Now, there have been egregious violations in this country. Think of the Philadelphia riots in the 1830s. Think of the Know Nothing movement, the nativism, the discrimination against Catholics or against Jews. There's no question. But while many people today dismiss the framers for their blind spot over slavery and the treatment of women, and sadly, those two blind spots are right. Those things were wrong. But the framers got religious liberty almost nearly right from the very beginning. And their achievements should never be thrown out, along with the failings in other areas. In other words, religious liberty here, rightly understood, as being one of the crucial keys to social harmony, as it will be for many other places in the world in the future. So think of that first point generally. Why does religious liberty matter? We need to make powerful arguments to that today, because for various reasons, there's a mounting ignorance and neglect of it, and America is in danger of throwing away one of the key elements of its heritage. The second point. Examine some of the common mistakes of those trying to defend religious liberty today. A lot of people are very concerned about the depth of the culture warring on both sides, and they're doing all sorts of things to respond to it in various ways, but some of these things are misguided and they will never succeed. Let me give you three, some of which apply to conservatives and Christians, some which apply to liberals or whatever. But you can see a lot of mistakes are being made in fighting back against this. First, there are those who think we can rely on law alone. In the 80s, when I was involved in a religious liberty project about the time of the bicentennial, I was talking to one of the leaders of the ACLU who said to me, "We will always win in the culture wars for a simple reason. We have more lawyers than anyone else." And at the time, they did, but not now. Now you see batteries of lawyers on that side with huge defense funds and an endless series of things they're litigating, countered by massive batteries of lawyers on the conservative side with equally huge defense funds and endless series of things they're litigating. And what happens? Increased litigation, deeper and deeper bitterness, and no answer. Now, if we read the classics like Cicero and Polybius, or great modern commentators from the 18th century like Montesquieu or Tocqueville, let me put it in Tocqueville's tone. You will never protect religious liberty or any freedom by law alone. The law is precious. In many ways, the law, the rule of law, and due process are a fundamental and precious bulwark for freedom. But they will never protect freedom by themselves. What you need, in Tocqueville's terms, is also the habits of the heart. Or in Montesquieu's terms, you need not only the structures of law, you need the spirit of liberty in the hearts of citizens. And you can see conservatives today are making a huge mistake by counting liberal litigation with endless conservative litigation, and the hole is being dug deeper and deeper and deeper, and America is no nearer a solution. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not against law. I'm speaking against law alone, and it will never do it. That's a fatal mistake, say, of the Christian right. Or take a second common mistake that people are making in countering the culture wars. That is to fight for my interests, or your interests individually, rather than the interests of the common good. Again, back in the 80s, a Jewish journalist said to me one day, talking about the Christian right, these people talk of justice, but what they really mean is just us. And if you listen to a lot of the rhetoric of how the money is raised, how the alarms are created, how people are mobilized and so on, you can see it's all about us. It's our rights that are going. That never works. The essence of religious liberty, freedom of thought and conscience, is that it's mutual, it's reciprocal, it's universal. Now, Christians should have reasons of their own for that. The Golden Rule, for example. Do for others what we'd like them to do for us, but we don't practice that. And it's fatal. Now, the fact is that a right for one is always a right for another, and a responsibility for both. So a right for a Christian is a right for a Jew, is a right for an atheist, is a right for a Mormon, is a right for a Muslim, and a responsibility of all together. In other words, rights are best protected when the tiniest community feels safe, and when the most unpopular community knows that their rights are guaranteed. And any of us tonight who are in this audience who are followers of Jesus, that should be our concern. Not to fight just for ourselves, but to fight for what's the common good, and above all, those who are the last and the least and need fighting for, because there's no one bigger to fight for them. Christians have made a terrible mistake by sounding about just us, when the issue is justice and the common good for everybody. The third common mistake is one that's made by liberals, and it's now manipulated, I'm afraid, by Muslims. And that is the idea of fighting the negative with the negative. If you fight the negative, you've got to fight it above all with the positive. Now, what do I mean? A generation ago, liberals thought we have a real problem in the culture wars, so we've got to make people more sensitive. So they began examining speech and talking about sensitivity speech, and then criminalizing hate speech and so on. Now, hate speech, how do you judge? It's very subjective. Hate is in the eye of the beholder. And if something's subjective like that, it's putting a sword in the hand of the power wielder. And you can see that this in turn has led to other mistakes, like the so-called phobiaization of disagreements. The gays picked this up first. You disagree with it? You're suffering from homophobia. And immediately, what happens? All disagreements are silenced. And then came Muslims, and they learned, you're suffering from Islamophobia. And then, horror of horrors, Christians were advised to claim these people are suffering from Christophobia. Now, it's certainly true that 75% or so of the world's persecutions are against Christians. Christians happen to be the most persecuted faith in the world, as well as being the most numerous faith in the world. But can those of you who are Christians tonight realize how obscene that is? at the heart of our faith, the great symbol of our faith, is our Lord naked, tortured, killed on an executioner's instrument. We of all faiths in the world expect no better. And we're not here to complain if people insult or blaspheme or defame us. That to us is a badge of pride to pick up the folly of the cross and go after our Lord. In other words, we differ radically from the Muslims, who use that manipulatively very often, but are insulted and defamed and so on, and now using that tool in dangerous ways. Now you see what they've done. Freedom of thought and conscience protects believers. It never protects beliefs. That's incredibly important. Freedom of conscience protects believers. It never protects beliefs. And as soon as you shift, it's beliefs that are now being protected, you silence debate. And it's ironic that liberals have brought this in, this nonsense about hate speech and so on, and now the Muslims are capitalizing on it. The end result is a silencing of debate. And any of us who care for a rational, liberal, democratic debate, and that should be so in universities too, we should stand against all this nonsense. Homophobia, Islamophobia, Christophobia, whatever. Let's have disagreements where we have disagreements and disagree civilly and, I trust, persuasively. But those who are trying to fight the negative with the negative make things actually worse when you've got to teach the positive, which is freedom of conscience, and knowing the so-called 3 R's of freedom of conscience: rights, responsibilities, and respect. Always fight the negative above all with the positive and not with the negative. Now let's go on to the heart of the issue. What are the models and the visions on offer that can lead us forward on this issue? At the moment, as you know, there are a myriad of issues going on. This last month, has been about contraception. The early ones 50 years ago were about school prayer, and hundreds of issues in between. But in fact, if you analyze the issues, there are 2 competing models, both turning on how religion should enter public life, if at all. One model is what's called the sacred public square, that wants to establish or at least prefer one faith or another at the expense of all the others. The other model is what's called the naked public square, which wants to exclude all faiths from public life, and then, of course, unintentionally ends up by favoring secularism as a non-faith. The sacred public square against the naked public square, and many of the arguments, the ACLU and the Christian, you name it, are all about that in essence. Now, there are obviously variations of both of those. So take the sacred public square. About the mildest establishment today is the Church of England that I was teasing gently a little earlier. The Church of England's not in danger of any inquisition or anything horrendous. It's about as mild and innocuous as you can get. Obviously, at the other end of the scale, you have Iran. And any Baha'i or evangelical or anyone disagreeing with the Ayatollahs in Iran knows what they face today and the horrendous current examples of oppression. Or you take, say, women under the Taliban or people under Saudi Arabia. You have a variation from mild establishments like the Church of England to very, very harsh, brutal, exclusive establishments like those ones I've mentioned. And the same way you have variations on the secular side. What the ACLU is arguing for is relatively mild, even compared, say, with the French. And the French is relatively mild, certainly compared, say, with the Chinese and the North Koreans. So you have variations. But if you look at them, either one ends up as unjust and unworkable, because with this explosive diversity we have today, most people don't have their rights in the public square. What's the answer to that? It's the notion that's called a civil public square. What's that? A civil public square is a vision of public life where everybody is free to enter and engage public life on the basis of their faith. That's freedom of conscience. But, here's the big but. Within a framework of what is understood and agreed and passed on from generation to generation, within a framework of what is agreed to be just and free for everybody else too. In other words, people know their rights, but they also know responsibilities and respect for others. And that will assume a whole number of things, including the necessity, for example, of persuasion. If you go into the public square and you want your views to prevail, you have to persuade other people who don't share your views, and so on and so on and so on. Now, civility has no powerful backing at the national level or the international level today. But worse still, at the average person's level, it's highly misunderstood. So let me pick up some of the simple misunderstandings of civility. First, civility is not niceness. You know, you talk about being civil, and people are talking as if we're squeamish about differences, or we're talking about dinner party etiquette or something like that. No. Civility is the classical word for the virtue and the duty that allows citizens of the same society to negotiate differences with others peacefully. It's a classical duty and virtue. It is not another word for niceness. But the second misunderstanding, even more important for Christians, and that is civility is not a search for a lowest common denominator unity. Some people give you the impression, people like Karen Armstrong and so on, that if we talk long enough and we're nice enough to enough people, eventually we'll all get down to some happy place where our differences are resolved and we've reached an underlying human unity. Nonsense. If you think the differences between us at the level of faiths, philosophies of life, and worldview, the differences are ultimate and irreducible. I mean, you just need to ask, say, the difference between a Jew and a Hindu, or a Muslim and an atheist. Are you really, with worldviews like that, really going to dig down deep enough till you reach the common unity? Nonsense. The differences are ultimate and irreducible. How then do you have unity? It is not a unity at the level of religious unity. If you achieve that, each faith would have to be unfaithful to what it believes, because to be faithful is to get down to the differences that are irreducible. The unity is at the level of what I call that political framework of the 3 R's: rights, responsibilities, and respect. Now let me give you the illustration of the Queensbury rules in boxing. Any of you know the history of sports? You may know that the Romans banned boxing because it was too brutal. A little odd when you think of their gladiatorial games. But they banned boxing, and certainly it was rather brutal until the 19th century. And you know, in Colorado or London, the bare-knuckle fights that went on the heaths or whatever, sometimes they'd fight 100 rounds, and one or other of the boxers would die at the end of it. It was pretty brutal. Then the Marquis of Queensbury lent his name in the 19th century to the new rules, which, quote, semi-civilized boxing. What did he do? He put it in a ring, under a referee, within rules. Now, they still touch gloves at the beginning, and then they fight. But they don't, say, punch below the belt. It's in a ring, under a referee, within rules. But there are winners and losers. Isn't that democracy? Currently, the Democrats are in the White House. And all you good Republicans today in College Station hope that in November you'll get the Democrats out of the White House or whatever. And you, no, that's not my point. But one way or another, you expect one to be in, one to be out, and the other side accepts and tries harder the next time to get the rascals out or whatever. And that's actually the same thing with civility. You take something like abolition. William Wilberforce entered the ring fighting abolition, and for 20 rounds, 20 years, he was solidly defeated every single year. But eventually, thank God, he prevailed and abolition was abolished. Slavery was abolished. And so on. That's the Queensbury rules. In other words, a tough, robust debate. Civility is not, again, niceness or a search for a lowest common denominator, ecumenical unity. But there's a third misunderstanding, that civility is a form of moral indifference, a toleration that eventually accepts everything. The teenagers, whatever. The Frenchman's shrug of the shoulders. I don't care, you do whatever you like. No, not at all. Let me put it like this. The right to believe anything does not mean that anything anyone believes is right. There's a difference between the first half of the sentence and the second half. The right to believe anything is freedom of conscience. Those who are Christians think God allows us to choose eternity without Him rather than, in Roger Williams' phrase, raping our conscience. The right to believe anything is absolute. But that doesn't for a moment mean that anything anyone believes is right. That's sheer nonsense. Some people's ideas are muddle-headed. Some people's ideas are socially disastrous. Some people's ideas are profoundly evil. In other words, we have the right and the freedom to engage them and to argue against them. Not their right to believe it, we respect that, but the consequences of all they're saying, and we hope that in argument we will prevail and win the argument for whatever we're trying to argue for. Now you've got to decide this for yourself. Sadly, and I'm speaking as a follower of Jesus, sadly, if we look at 2,000 years of Christian history, much of the church did not follow the way of Jesus. And much of today's aggressive secularism is a reaction against the corrupt state churches of the past. Now, obviously, compared with Torquemada, things like that, the Inquisition, the slaughter of the Albigensians, the slaughter of the Huguenots in France, the Christian right is small peanuts. But by its unwisdom and its rhetorical extremism, to many people today, it sounds like the echoes of that. And you've got to say, sadly, that in this country, well, in Europe, Christians are understood in terms of the past, and in this country, secularists often see them in terms of the fears of the past. We have not been on the side of the angels very often. Now, at the same time, many of the greatest voices, the greatest pioneers of freedom of conscience and religious liberty were people of faith. I've just mentioned Roger Williams, maybe the greatest of them all. So your generation has really got to decide, do you really stand for soul freedom, freedom of thought and conscience for all, not just us, for all? Do you really stand for a robust civility in a civil public square that allows people of the other faiths to enter into, and allows us, of course, to enter in and engage with them? Now, if we're to go forward on this, which I personally trust and hope that humanity will, I think we can take courage from the history of human rights. If you look at the whole human rights story from Magna Carta right down through the Bill of Rights and the French Bill of Rights, right down to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, you can see that the Universal Declaration, which is the strongest statement so far in human history, has coincided with massacres, say like Rwanda or Srebrenica, but that doesn't contradict the power of what it's done so far. And if you ask how it's done it, you can see that human rights are slowly established in 3 separate steps. And what's true of that would be true of civility and religious liberty too. The first step is always a declaration. If you've ever read the Universal Declaration, that's all it is, a declaration of principle. There's nothing binding in it at all. It's a declaration of ringing principles on behalf of humanity. The second step was implementation. Now, it was taking those principles and implementing them into law and constitution. But even that, which in many cases, in many countries, followed 15, 20, 25 years later after the Universal Declaration, that wasn't enough. And people have always realized the third step is the crucial one: civic education. It's when principles which are declared in ringing form are then put into laws, but they have to be translated down to what Tocqueville calls the habits of the heart, and then freedom and justice are truly safe. Will it happen? Your generation will have a key part. Tocqueville, whom all of you know, wrote the famous book Democracy in America. Americans love it because it's a great praise of American democracy. But you probably know too, he didn't write it for Americans. He wrote it for his fellow Frenchmen. And he was a great admirer of the American Revolution and a disappointed lover of his own country's French Revolution. And all his life he was comparing and contrasting the lessons of the two of them. And he made a very interesting little remark towards the end of his life. He said this: with a revolution, as with a novel, the hardest part to invent is the ending. Now that comes home to you again today, because remember I started, your generation is the crunch generation. Your founders, in terms of this issue, wrote a magnificent first chapter. And there have been many stirring pages and chapters written since then. But your parents' generation, not blaming your parents, but your parents' generation, are in danger of losing the greatness of this heritage. And after 50 years of deepening, bitterly culture warring, America is further away from the founders than ever before. Now I speak as a European. The tragedy is that the framers called this country Novus Order Seclorum, the new order of the ages, which comes from the Latin writer, poet Livy. But when they did it, and they called America the new order of the ages, or the first new nation, things like this, the rest of the world went on its ancient ways unimpressed. They were not grappling with the big wrestle problems that America was grappling with 230 odd years ago. But now, the whole world is beginning to grapple with these problems. And at the very moment certain people around the world are beginning to see the significance of the American experiment, they look at America and look what you're doing. Bitter culture wars, and you're not living up to your heritage. So again, I challenge you as the crunch generation. You've got to think through these things for yourself and have clear, solid convictions, and then go out and argue for these in the public square across America under the conditions of the present culture wars, and by God's grace, I hope, prevail to write a great chapter for our time. And this time, not only for the United States, but potentially for much of the world. Over to you for our time of questions, and I believe what we've done, we've got a couple of mics here, so if anyone wants to raise a point, challenge me, or ask a question or anything, make your way down to the mics, and we'll have a time of questioning.
I thought of this morning when thinking about...
Speak into the mic so I can hear you back.
In thinking about my kids, obviously a different generation, and how they put things on Facebook. And I realized the problem I've had with this is I don't want information to be there. I want you to talk to me. So the virtual global public forum, is it real communications, or is it just a place to make noise?
Mm-hmm. Well, clearly we have moved from the physical, which is face-to-face, to the metaphorical, which is somewhat distant, although much of that communication, as they say, was from the few to the many. Take, say, the rise of modern newspapers. Now we've moved to communication from the many to the many with the new social media. Now, There are huge drawbacks with it, but there are some positives, and we've got to recognize it'll be used. I thought you were going to go in a different direction. Some friend of mine recently had her 2 teenage kids and had breakfast with Bob Mueller, the director of the FBI. And my friend said to Bob Mueller, share what you think my kids should do as they go on towards college and so on. And Bob was very, very clear. He turned to the boy and he said, study hard at mathematics, join the Marines, and never, ever appear on Facebook. And you know, one of the founders of Google said, half jokingly, that when we get to 21, we should be able to take on a new identity, because people are so embarrassed by that trail of things they've left. And you know, any of you know any CEOs or HR people in the big corporations, they know exactly how to raid the internet and get everything you've left on everything on Facebook for your interview. And many people don't even get invited in because of stuff they know, and I know that from the business world. But that's slightly different. There are other problems. I mentioned television sound bites. How, for instance, could you have a Lincoln-Douglas debate under the conditions of television sound bites? But you take something else like direct mail. Studies show if you just take, say, Christian right or some Christian activist and political activist, and just put the letter out on the table and just analyze every word underlined in red or green. Pick those words out. What do they all appeal to? 80% of them appeal to fear. Whereas the most common refrain in the Bible, the most common refrain of Jesus, have no fear. And yet Christians have just adapted to direct mail using its way. Or you take the one I mentioned briefly. The real degradation of discourse comes from anonymity in the screen names of bloggers. And where people can go on with anonymous screen names, so they're not accountable, no one knows who they are, the discourse quickly descends to the barbaric and the thoroughly degrading. So our challenge, we've got to ourselves show a different way, and we've got to bring up our kids and our families and our grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and you've all got to do the same. If we, for instance, we Christians, this is sub-Christian as well as undemocratic. So as Christians, those of us who are, we're called to speak the truth with love. And part of the toughest ethics of the way of Jesus, our Lord, we are to love even our enemies. Now you look at William Wilberforce. He was remarkable. He was the most vilified man in Europe, which probably meant the world, in his day. He was twice physically mugged, and the descriptions of him in the cartoons and so on are unspeakable. He was always loving and humble and civil. One day, one of his worst enemies died. Wilberforce immediately saw that the man's widow had a pension and something to live on. I mean, he was truly loving to his enemies. And you can see how much the Christian right has often been sub-Christian because it's done the Lord's work in the world's way, often demonizing, stereotyping its enemies. And we've got to go a different way, all of us who are Christians. But those who care for democracy have got to go a different way too. But we've got to do that in an age where things like anonymous screen blogs are par for the course.
I guess there are kind of 2 parts to this question. You've talked a lot about respect being core to the public discourse. So the first half there is, it seems like in any vibrant community in which we have people sharing their ideas and debating, there are going to be people who are not respectful of each other. Mm-hmm. And the second half of that question, building on that, thinking of a specific case, the pastor in Florida who's burning Qurans. Public discourse protected by our civil laws, but in this global public square that you've mentioned, a form of public discourse that has very significant implications around the world, in terms of putting U.S. troops at harm, in terms of putting people in general at harm. At what point does the global reality cause us to legitimately or illegitimately infringe upon an individual's right to speak and their freedom to converse in the public square?
No, he was a pastor, so he had the right to speak. And I think we, on the one hand, you remember a few years ago, you probably wouldn't, I'm a little older, been here, I came to the country in '84, but I remember back then, the Jews were terrific in supporting the right of Nazis to march in Skokie, Illinois. And there's a place in which we do that, where we defend the rights of those who are our enemies, because the common good and our rights too. Now, in that case, though, I think I agreed with those Christians who went down to the pastor and said, do you realize what you're doing in the name of Christ, the image you're doing to Christ? It wasn't a matter of freedom of speech. It was a matter of his responsibility for being a pastor and doing that. I mean, my grandparents were in China during the Boxer riots. 2,000 Christians were killed in a week. My grandfather nearly died. He was 26 then and unmarried, but they decided, the group where they were, and he was a doctor in a hospital, they would never defend themselves because they were there for the Lord. And so they'd go out of their way to take whatever was coming against Christians because they were the ambassador of Jesus to China. And that was their decision. And that pastor, I think, sadly, the Christian leaders who went down couldn't prevail on him. So yes, he had every right to say it. But he had a responsibility as a spokesman for Christ to do something which honored our Lord, and he did not. He was a disgrace to our Lord. And sadly, many Christians have tarnished the name of Jesus by the extreme unwisdom of their acts. Now let me do one thing in the first sentence you said about respect. You didn't ask this, but I want to make clear the difference between respect and toleration. Toleration is always better than the opposite, intolerance. But toleration is not the word to defend today. It's John Locke's word, but it has a very basic weakness. Tolerance is condescending. It's always the powerful tolerating the weak, the majority tolerating the minority, the government tolerating us citizens. No, freedom of conscience is inalienable. No government, no majority, no scientific discovery, nothing has the right to come between an individual and his or her conscience. That's respect. Tolerance is far too weak a word, and we need to get our liberal friends to say it's not what we need. We want something much tougher because of real human rights at stake here.
I want to preface my question by saying a couple of things. Alistair McIntyre, in his book After Virtue, sets out an image that he says portrays what's going on in the university and also in the public square, and he says you have a bunch of incommensurable ideas and worldviews, and people champion these worldviews, but they don't realize that they're incommensurable, which means at the bottom level there is no common agreement. And you suggested that's the case as you talked about religions, and you can't really go to a base level where everyone agrees. And McIntyre, I think, similarly suggests that what you need to do is have a university where people can, over long periods of time, argue and try to see whose views are correct. And as he lays out his understanding of it, again, it takes quite a long time. And yet, many of us would push McIntyre on a particular point, and that's, what do you do when you feel that things that need to be changed quickly? And you realize that there is such great incommensurability. So perhaps you don't have the same sort of, conscience, same sorts of things you can appeal to that Wilberforce would have been able to appeal to when he was talking to his fellow Englishmen. And I'm wondering what you would say to Christians who might feel strongly about particular political issues. We shouldn't phrase it that way, but that's the way we often do. When they want to see these things change but realize that there are these incommensurable views, how do you recommend that they go about rigorously championing their views but realizing that it's going to take a long time for others to understand what their views may be and why they hold them?
Mm-hmm. Are the worldviews incommensurable, to use the philosophical term, ultimately and forever? I don't think so. I would argue they are, at root, irreconcilable and ultimate. That's true. But there is the possibility of persuasion across worldviews. And there is the possibility of what John Rawls rightly calls an overlapping consensus. But what you're talking about is more persuasion. Now, this is a matter, put it in Christian terms, I imagine many of you tonight are Christians, this is a matter of what's technically known as apologetics. How do you persuade people of other worldviews who are very different? And that was actually a problem for Wilberforce too. And he wrestled with this. So people were Englishmen, as you said, but the majority thought slavery was right, nasty but necessary, and he had to persuade them. And you know one of his little persuading things, you may have seen the little plate. His friend was Josiah Wedgwood, who produced Wedgwood China, and they produced a little plate with the head of an African slave and chains all around him. And then they knew from the scriptures that questions are more subversive and therefore persuasive than statements. And so they put a question round the plate, am I not a man and a brother? You remember the US Constitution said slaves were 3/5 human. And Wilberforce, no. Am I not a man and a brother? Here is a full human being with dignity. And that little plate went all over the stately homes of Europe. People looked at the question. It was a very persuasive, he called it a launcher. Now you can discuss, if you want, the philosophical roots of persuasion. I would argue, we don't want to get into too much of that tonight, but I would argue that the scriptures give us a basis for persuasion, so there's no one, however extreme their differences, say, from the biblical view, that can't be persuaded. They may start at positions which look incommensurable, but in fact you can persuade people across. Now the question is why. That would take us into areas I don't want to go tonight. But I think you leave it there with McIntyre's point, you don't go anywhere. Now that becomes practical, as you said, with politics. Take, say, Christian conservatives' two supreme social issues, abortion and traditional marriage. I'm against abortion, and I'm in favor of traditional marriage. The trouble with much of the campaign, it lacks persuasion. I was, a number of years ago, had dinner with the founder of MTV. Made a lot of money, but more importantly, he really knew how to persuade teens and 20s in their opinions. And we were discussing the pro-life campaign, and he said to me, the pro-life movement would have won this 10 years ago if they knew how to persuade. He said they protest, they picket, they pronounce, they preach, baby killer and all. There's no persuasion in the campaign. And I think he's right. Wilberforce knew how to argue for human dignity against people from all sorts of different backgrounds. Like the Apostle Paul says, I'm a Jew to the Jews, I'm a Gentile to the Gentiles, I'm all things to all people to win them to Jesus. And Christians lack persuasion. And if ever we needed persuasion, put it another way. You know, when I first visited the States in 1968, there was still a lingering memory of the old Christian consensus, especially in the South. I didn't come to College Station then, but I imagine it was very strong then until relatively recently. There was a Christian consensus. Even if people weren't themselves Christians, they could speak and even understand Christian. And what's happened to America at large since the 50s is the public square has grown more secular and private life has grown more diverse. So there's all sorts of people of all sorts of different positions, incommensurable, and so we need to be persuasive. You can no longer just preach. You can't be simple, straightforward. You have to be much more creative and subversive in getting people to think in ways that they're not used to thinking. So yes, I think McIntyre makes some great points. But the Christian would counter that with a proper view of persuasion. There's no one that you can't speak to persuasively. Yes, sir.
Thanks for coming. This has been really great.
No, my pleasure.
Yeah. So earlier you said that the differences that we have with each other and the pluralism in our world, they're irreducible, I think was the word you used, right?
Irreducible and ultimate. At their presuppositions, their roots.
Okay.
Yeah.
So to go back to your image of making decisions or democracy as a boxing match, and this kind of follows up Nathan's question. I wonder, so if our differences at their root are irreducible, one, how do we actually come to make decisions? And can we do that in a way that's unlike a boxing match where somebody loses, you know?
Okay. Well, let me pick up the other half of it. I answered one half, and this brother. The other half would be Rawls's notion of an overlapping consensus. In other words, at the level of the roots of our faith, atheist, Jew, Mormon, Muslim, Buddhist, you name it, Christian, at the level of the roots of our faith, the differences are ultimate and irreducible. But at the level of the results of our faith, or the fruits of our faith, there is what Rawls calls an overlapping consensus. Now let me take a practical example. In the state of Maryland, when they really got down to some very bitter arguments about whose values you teach in public school, one of the district got together all the parents who were then parents of kids in the schools and said, all right, tell us the 12 values you want us to teach. And there were people of all sorts of faith backgrounds, and atheists and agnostics too. And I can't remember what all 12 were, but I remember the first 3 were honesty, loyalty, and patriotism. That's the only 3 I remember. In other words, their point was, in the public schools, they agreed to teach honesty, loyalty, patriotism, and the other 9 that I can't remember. But their point was, you in the Jewish home, you teach your Jewish roots for honesty. You as atheists, if you want, actually I think the atheists have a lot harder time doing it, but you in the atheist home teach your atheist roots for honesty. You in the Christian home teach your Christian roots for honesty, but we will teach the value for society in the school. Do you see? That's a matter of the overlapping consensus, but at the level of the results, the fruits of faith, not the roots. And so, if you ever got to a place in America where there was such diversity and such disagreement that you couldn't even find an overlapping consensus, what happens? The American Republic collapses. Becomes totally unstable. And that's why you've got to keep talking, persuading, engaging, in order to keep that living consensus alive. If Christians had been doing that all along, we wouldn't have been where we are today. But we weren't. So we've all got a vested interest. If you believe in the Republic, or if you believe in a democracy, you've got to play your part in keeping the assumptions and requirements lively by engaging yourself. And when you differ very solidly, as you said people do, you know, gay friends, I respect your right to believe what you believe. Now, I differ strongly with the social consequences of some of these things, but I've got to love that person enough and respect their right to believe what they believe enough so that when I talk with my disagreements, I'm not blowing them out of the water, but I'm really engaging and hopefully winning.
I would like to just make an observation that before coming here, I was in a program over at the Bush Library where Andy Card, the dean of the Bush School, was having a, quote, conversation with Nancy Pelosi. And they came from very different perspectives. And as Andy mentioned in his introduction, he disagreed very much with her philosophy and her positions on most issues. But the two of them went about demonstrating to the group there what civility is all about, how to have an engaged and robust conversation without trying to destroy and demonize one another. So I think the two of them has made, for me, a very interesting evening. Thank you.
Now, I wish that was true of all Washington political discussions. As you know well, it's not, and sometimes... Oh, we needn't mention any names. But, but no, that's wonderful. And of course, that was common. When I first came to D.C. again, it was well known that Tip O'Neill, Irish and Democratic, would sit down and have a whiskey or something with the Republicans on the other side. And LBJ? Absolutely. But today, no. Today not, sadly. And sadly, every 4 or 5 years they call a civility weekend, and all the congressmen shipped up to Hershey. And for 2 or 3 weeks, everything's sweetness and light, and we're back to the normal slugging. I think we need a leader at the highest national level, higher than Speaker Pelosi, to get up and articulate some of these things. I mean, I wrote a book on this, and I had a call from the White House. You remember when Congressman Giffords was shot, and you had the Arizona murders? There was a moment when the country was sort of talking about it, and the president made a couple of speeches, and I got a call from some of the White House people talking about his response, and I said, well, he was calling for civility at the expense of murderousness and all these things, but excuse me, he never gave a first principle explanation of what civility is. And I said, how about a speech on X or whatever? And they said, no, he gave 2 shots at it, and they were both rebuffed. That's it. But somehow we need a leader of a kind of Lincoln-like stature who will stand above it and say, a plague on both your houses. There is a better way for the sake of all Americans and the American future. And at the moment, that sort of courage is more among the citizenry than it is among the leaders. And that's part of the problem, but I'm glad to hear it. Now, Andy Card would be terrific at that. I'm sure she was on her best behavior in the house of one of the most civil presidents we've had.
And George Bush first was there also, and she was very complimentary.
Well, I mean, he is gracious and humble. He is the perfect gentleman mirroring civility. Anyway, next generation, the crunch generation, you do it by God's grace.
Well, I think
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.